Title of the lecture today is The City and the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is one of these things, it's a term like Renaissance, where the people who were involved were not using that term. It's a term that is applied after the fact, and it refers to a period between the late 1600s and the early 1800s that is associated with science and with sort of changes in political systems. The French Revolution, the American War of Independence could all be considered sort of outcomes or products of this period of Enlightenment thought. It's very broad, and so it's elusive, but I would say that if you had to characterize it by one facet, it would be skepticism, the sort of skepticism that is embedded within scientific method, right? I have a theory, I have a hypothesis, I will create a series of experiments to determine whether or not my hypothesis is true. I have to tell a story on my wife because I think it's cute, although she would kill me if she knew I was going to tell you this story. But since none of you know her, I will tell it anyway. When her parents, both dead now, but when her parents were quite old, we had to move them from the house that they had lived in for a very long time down in Savannah. So I was moving boxes of stuff, and the top popped open of one box, and in it was a schoolwork that my mother-in-law had saved from when my wife was grammar school, middle school, high school, that sort of thing. And on top was a green sort of notebook, paper binder that said something science, and obviously they had been studying the scientific method. I think she was in the 7th or 8th grade. And the hypothesis, so I opened it up and it said, number one page. Hypothesis, the Earth rotates on its axis. I went to page 2, and it said equipment. Nothing about the method of trying to actually prove this or not, but just said equipment, a ball, a string, and a stick. And I turned it to page 3, and it said conclusion, the Earth rotates on its axis. My wife was not a scientist, but sort of embedded within the notion of scientific method, which obviously she did not understand, at least not in the 8th grade, is the notion of skepticism, that we don't know this to be true unless we can demonstrate it, and then we can repeat it, or someone else can repeat it independently from us, right? We might hypothesize that it is possible to create nuclear fusion in a mason jar, right? As some people at Georgia Tech did a number of years ago, and got in a lot of trouble because nobody else could repeat this, the results of this experiment. So they thought that they had, in fact, perhaps rigged the outcome. I think that's very important. I mean, if you look, and this happens in political situations all the time. If you listen to people when they make arguments about things, they often will only use the facts that support their argument, right? Whatever it is. And that's really the opposite of skepticism, right? As a sort of honored tradition. You want to look at all the evidence and then sort of draw a conclusion based upon that evidence. Our system, our judicial system, which guarantees the right to a trial by a jury of your peers, it's divided into two parts. Criminal, which is murder, for example, which would be a crime against the state, and civil, which is from old Roman tort law, which is I run into Jennifer in the parking lot out here, and therefore it's a civil action, right? My tree falls on my neighbor's house. That's a civil action, right? Property law deals with civil action as opposed to criminal. And I mention that distinction because in criminal cases, the The standard is that it must be, the jury must conclude unanimously beyond a reasonable doubt. Whereas in civil cases, the standard is the preponderance of the evidence suggests. It's a much lower standard, right? There's a difference between preponderance of evidence. You sort of put all the evidence up on the scale, and the scale does this, then you say, well, the preponderance of the evidence suggests that this is heavier, right? And of course, scientific method is not very useful for things that can only be evaluated subjectively. And if you go back and read a lot of the sort of, particularly the aesthetic philosophy of the, that is, the world as perceived through the senses of the 18th century, you will see attempts, in fact, to sort of objectify what is essentially subjective experience. There's still a lot of this around. I mean, I saw a paper once at a conference where some people at a university and a school of architecture were trying to study hospital rooms to see if the sort of color of the walls and the paintings that were on the walls improved the time of healing. So I got tickled because this woman puts up a picture, you know, Edward Munch, you know, the artist of The Scream, you know, this painting, this person, and they put the painting on the wall, and people are sort of in the ICU unit, they kind of come around, they've been in a coma, and they wake up and they see this guy screaming, you know, and guess what? They didn't like that. But, you know, if it was Yosemite Valley with bluebirds, you know, it was much better. And somehow they concluded that you were able to shave 1.73 hours off of recovery time if you had pictures of bluebirds rather than Edward Munch's The Scream. Duh. Anyway, but the same kind of thing. I mean, there are some evidence coming out of Virginia and Connecticut on the Iowa test of basic skills, which every grammar school student in the United States takes at 3rd grade and at 5th grade, I believe. And that even when you control for things like income and ethnicity and parental background and all kinds of things, there is a differential in those scores of about 8 points, 8 to 10 points better if the room in which the test was taken had a certain amount of natural light and a certain indoor air quality. So it's an attempt to sort of create evidence that in fact there is a positive correlation between the environment of the room and learning. And of course, if you're an architect, that's good news, unless you're the one that's designed the room that everybody's getting low scores in, right? But that sort of thing is useful, and it comes from this kind of notion of a belief in reason and a belief in a sort of method that has embedded within it what is in fact a quite honorable tradition, skepticism. Oh, I don't know that it's true, right? Well, pick something that's controversial. Global warming. Is it true? Well, I don't know. We need to collect enough data so that we can then find out, right? So all of this way of thinking is something which is sort of characterized by the Enlightenment. And when you get into this, you don't get very far until you sort of come into faith versus reason, right? It becomes quite difficult. I've always said that Thomas Aquinas, the medieval monk philosopher, had an advantage over us in that he knew what light was. We don't, right? For Thomas Aquinas, light was an emanation from God, right? But in our skeptical way of thinking, we say, well, yeah, but it must have some physical properties. It behaves both as a particle and as a wave, but it can't be both a particle and a wave. It has to be one or the other by the laws of physics as we understand them, right? And so you constantly sort of try to work and tease this stuff out. So the point is, between faith and reason, very quickly you run into some difficulty. This period, so we're just going to say it's the 18th century for the sake of several new things come into play at this point. So before we actually get into the impact, it will have an impact on cities, but before we get into that impact, I want to talk about one of these things that develops, and that is the invention of landscape. Now, this is a word that does not even come into use in English until the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Doesn't exist. I was reading a translation of the letters of Pliny the Younger about 15 years ago, specifically Book 5, Letter 6 to Domitius Apollinaris. It was a description of Pliny's Tuscan villa. And in the translation, the English translation, it said that when I walk out on my terrace, basically, the view before me is such a landscape. And I said, something's wrong. Because that word, if you can look it up in your dictionaries, you'll see that it in fact is not, it's entirely a product of this period. So I went to the Latin copy of it. The Loeb series has Latin on one side and English on the other. And I went through the text and I found it. And you know what the word was that she was translating as landscape? What does carta mean? It's very close in Spanish. Map. It means a map. It looked like a map. It didn't look like a landscape. It looked like a map. Right? It's a different thing. In fact, in Italian and French, for example, today, there is no equivalent word. There's a close word. In French, it's paysage, which means countryside, or in Italian, passaggio, which means countryside, but it is not the same. Countryside is not the same as landscape. If I said, I am a countryside architect, what does that connote? That I'm out on a farm somewhere, sort of arranging barns and cattle, or something, right? Whereas in designing barns. Whereas if I said I'm a landscape architect, then obviously what would come to mind would be, say, the plaza in front of this building. Well, obviously there is no landscape architecture because there is no landscape. There were trees and mountains and rivers and things, but there was nothing that we sort of collectively called this until this period, until around 1700. Now, the word, just so you know, this won't be in any tests, but it's a Celtic word, land, and that is a German word, scape. The word in German is actually shaft, and it has a related word, ship, in English. Not a ship that sails in the ocean, but ship as in friendship, right? A collective thing. The German word for this is Landschaften, and the Celtic word land, which may be the oldest word in continuous use in English today, actually means the interval between two furrows in a plowed field was a land. Those of you who were, anybody here in the Army? Gosh, isn't that amazing? Usually I get a bunch of hands. If you are familiar with rifles, the rifling in a barrel, the interval of that rifling is called a land. If you're in Scotland, the divisions of an apartment building is called a land, right? So it's interesting that these countries that come up out of this kind of Northern European Germanic tradition still have land often in their name, in the actual name, Deutschland. They don't call themselves German. We do that. We use the Latin term for it. The French, it is Allemagne, and the Germans call themselves Deutsch. So it's Deutschland, right? Holland, England, Scotland, Ireland, Finland even, right? Even though they are not within any Indo-European tradition. Turkish and Finnish are very closely related languages. Anyway, landscape is invented, and it will have a profound impact on the way we begin to perceive the world, and the way we perceive it then has an impact on how we conceive of it, eventually how we make it materially. Now, the first thing in understanding this that's important is that today we would tend to conflate the term garden and landscape as being sort of somehow similar, when in fact, if we really break it all down, they are polar opposites, 180 degrees apart. A garden is an enclosed, bounded space, and it is different from a landscape. Out beyond that garden, we see a landscape, but a garden is this, which is enclosed within a sort of bounded world. In fact, the word garden, geared, there's a Russian word, grad, gorod, which like Petrograd, Leningrad, that actually means to enclose. And the word geared, the Germanic root, garden, actually the emphasis is on the enclosure, it's on the container, not on the contained. So with a garden, it's an objective architectural space. I am either in the garden or I am out of the garden, in the same way that I'm either in this room or I am out of this room, right? One or the other. It's an objective reality. Landscape is actually quite different. A landscape is formed in the mind's eye of the viewer. It may consist of either natural or man-made elements. Usually it is a combination of the two, natural and man-made. It has no material boundary. Rather, the boundary exists only in the mind of the person who sees it. So a landscape is brought into being through subjective experience. Now, there are two quotes I have. One is from the Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo, writing in the City of God in 429 AD in North Africa. And he says, I gathered those of like mind about me and withdrew into a garden given by my friend Valerius. From the profane world out here, I have withdrawn from that world into a garden, right? Whereas Ralph Waldo Emerson says, the landscape I saw this morning undoubtedly consists of 20 or 30 farms. Smith owns this, Manning that, and Locke the woodlot beyond. But there is property in the horizon reserved for he whose eyes can integrate all the parts. This is the best of these men's farms, and to this their warranty deeds hold no title. So the landscape here is the ability of the viewer to suppress the individuality of Manning and Smith and Locke, and to see within it some collective condition that somehow elevates all of this above what their warranty deeds, their individual titles to property suggest. Well, let's think about this in terms of our constitutional order. If the boundary is one of those four elements, what happens in landscape? Well, the boundary becomes vague. The boundary becomes indeterminate. It's dependent upon the subjective experience of a viewer, and as the architect of such, it depends upon my ability to replicate something so that you see it more or less the way I do, or experience it more or less the way I do. So, to simplify this, to attempt to simplify this, reduce it down, a garden is an objective architectural space. A landscape is brought into being through subjective experience, a view. Now, this will have some fairly profound effects on cities. Again, you can think about that just in terms of the vagueness of what the boundaries are. It requires then a redefinition of this word nature, which in the original Latin natura, the past participle of the word nace, to be born, nace. In French, I would say, je suis né à Paris. I was born in Paris. I would say in French, for me, je suis né à Atlanta. I was born in Atlanta. Natura meant the irreducible essence of something, as in, what is the nature of the problem, right? For us, post-Enlightenment creatures, nature means anything not artificial, all that stuff out there. And it creates a lot of confusion, I think, because we tend then to say, we talk about this word, which is a very elusive and slippery word, in which the way we use it already has a built-in kind of bias that causes us to think of the world and construct the world in a specific kind of way. Nature is man-made, and by that I mean it is a culturally conditioned term, right? If you go back and you read what the word Aristotle uses in Greek is physis, the physical, the physis. And then there's the metaphysis, which travels alongside of it. which is the idea or the thought behind it. Now, what's embedded in all of this, though, is our relationship to the natural world. So, if we go to Versailles, which we've already seen, built out pretty much in the form you see here between 1661 and 1700, we have what I was taught is man's dominance over nature. And I accepted that without question. This king, with this great axis extending out from his bedroom out over the countryside here. But I always like to interject then this to say, well, and often I would put up in a lecture such as this photograph and put Versailles on the other screen and ask the rhetorical question, which one is more natural? And 99 people out of 100 will say this is Stourhead in England, built between 1740 and 1780 by a man named Henry Hoare, H-O-A-R-E. So I would then ask, well, why is this more natural than that? This has grass, that has grass, this has water, that has water, this has trees, that has trees, this has a bridge, architectural elements, this has fountains, architectural elements. So why would most people, do you think, say this is more natural? I mean, what's the real difference here between this and this? What's obvious? This one has right angles. Ha-ha! Right angles. Orthogonal geometry. In the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, the assumption was that, as Horace Walpole wrote, William Hogarth wrote, nature abhors a straight line. We don't have straight lines in nature, do we? Or do we? I don't know. The only real difference here is that this doesn't have any, it is asymmetrical. It doesn't have orthogonal geometry, but otherwise all the elements are the same. And I will tell you that the birds don't care whether they build a nest there or whether they build a nest here. The worms and grasshoppers don't care if they're living here. In fact, they might prefer it to living here, because every so often somebody comes along with a set of shears and clips that back. One difference that is not so obvious but it is when you think about it, it's pretty hard to graze sheep here. But in the landscape garden, as it emerged, such as at Stourhead, sheep would be perfectly at home out here in this pasture, wouldn't they? Right? In fact, a few cows might even add to its kind of rural simplicity. Well, what has happened here? What has happened is that this word nature has now come to mean something quite different than what it meant before. Whereas here you're pruning these trees to reveal their nature, the new red growth in the springtime, for example, and the divine creator would never create anything that was imperfect. And therefore, Platonic forms, circles, squares, triangles, were geometric forms, right? I mean, after all, we are made in his image and we are symmetrical, more or less, right? The Vitruvian man that we know of. All right. So for the people in the 17th century, this was as much about nature as this was. Now, if you're interested in all of this, I teach a whole course in it in the spring. And I won't sidetrack us today any further than necessary. I only need to point out this extraordinary difference which emerges on this island, England, in the 18th century, and that will begin to affect cities in an extraordinary way. Now, interestingly enough, these are actually based upon paintings from the 17th century. This one by Claude Lorraine, called Aeneas at Delos, and I've often thought this was the first true postmodern painting. And I say that because here is Aeneas on his journeys from Troy, which apparently occurred sometime around 1120 to 1150 before the Common Era. And here on the island of Delos, he encounters a pantheon, which was in Rome, not on Delos, and was built between 126 and 128 AD. And without Roman concrete, it would not have been possible to span that dome like that, create that dome like that. And then if we look out often here in the distance, we have sort of medieval ships and Gothic kind of buildings and other things, a lighthouse or something out here. And then we see peasants crossing a bridge and some sheep and so forth grazing in the meadows. These come to be known in the 18th century as landscape paintings, even though they are not called that when they are painted. They're called the paintings of the Italian school, of which a French painter, Claude Lorraine, was probably the best known. And of course, why I'm going into all of this is that I believe that what I'm going to, over the next several lectures, the next few weeks, the argument is that this will affect directly the conception of the city as we see it here in the 19th century in Paris, from the Place de la Concorde up the Champs-Élysées, which was the great axis that André Lenotre extended out of the Jardin des Tuileries. In the same way, this will influence our conception of cities, such as this drawing that we see here. Does anyone recognize this drawing? Know who drew that? The Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier, and it is an illustration of the city of tomorrow done for the Exposition Arts et Décoratifs in Paris in 1924. Okay? They're very different. Conception of the city here in the 19th century, conception of the city here in the 20th century. So this affects, is drawn, affects this, which affects this, which affects this. This is Atlanta, Midtown, the view from Lake Claramere in Piedmont Park. This photograph is on the cover of the American Institute of Architects Guide to Atlanta. I find that interesting, right? This view across the trees of these towers rising in the distance. Compositionally, everything is asymmetrical. It's always either 8 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun is always coming. Usually in Lorraine paintings from the left, there's a foreground, a middle ground, a background, and this compositional style comes to be known as the picturesque, like a picture. Now this plays out in cities in extraordinary ways, and it's necessary to keep that sort of change, this invention of landscape, in the back of your mind as we go through this. There are three case studies that we'll use here. The first is Bath, that the reading refers to. Bath is the old Roman town of Aquasellus, and it developed along the Avon River as in the west of England as a wool trading center in the Middle Ages with a small church, although it was not a cathedral. The bishop was down the road in Bath. And we can still see the trace of Accardo and Decumanus, and we can imagine then from what we know about the Roman city that the Forum would have been somewhere in here, and it is not then following often what we see. The church is actually built more or less on the site of the Forum. It was a kind of popular spa because there were springs that flowed forth that were very warm, heated by subterranean volcanic action coming out about 170 degrees Fahrenheit, very hot, would burn you. We still see fragments of the Roman wall here sort of repaired in the 19th century to look as the 19th century people thought a Roman wall ought to look. And a model of it that we see here, small town, all these sort of Roman streets, which became very dirty, medieval streets, animal waste, human waste in the middle, no sidewalks, are now all sort of cleaned up because Bath is a sort of a resort town. And it got that way actually in this period in the 18th century when it was sort of discovered that in fact it had a Roman origin, and there was a tremendous amount of excitement about this. This was bolstered by visits by the Queen in 1702, 1703, who later built a house there. She wanted to take in the water, And that led to Bath becoming a desirable spot for those among the wealthy of English society, so much so that the city appointed an official master of ceremonies. Now, how many of you in here have seen the thing on TV, Downton Abbey? One person? That's it? Two people? Well, these English manors were out in the countryside, right? And there may be a village attached to it, but the village was in fact the working part. So these are the people that fed the horses and plowed the fields and fixed the carriages and, made barrels or whatever. Well, if you were a young woman in your 20s or a young man who was going to inherit this estate, how would you meet a suitable wife or husband? It's not like you can go down to the village blacksmith shop and say, you're kind of cute. Right? Because there's a structure, very stratified society at this time, 1700, 1750. So Bath became this place where it was sort of the ultimate family-style singles bar, where people would have these terrace houses that they would rent in the summer, and they would go there and then go to these parties so that the Duke of thus and such might meet the daughter of the Duke of this and that, right? Or vice versa. And you would marry off your children to those among your peers. It became then this great sort of center of social activity, so much more that the city had to appoint an official master of ceremonies, a man named Beau Nash, in 1704, sort of the social chairman of the sorority, so to speak, right? Or the fraternity. As Bath developed as a social center, Ralph Allen, as far as I know, no relation to me, who owned the stone quarry, saw an opportunity to develop the surrounding land as speculative real estate for those in London who wanted to have a second home in Bath. Partnering with the Earl of Essex and a certain person named Mr. Grey, about whom we know very little, who owned the land just to the northwest of the medieval wall. That was where Mr. Grey came in. He owned this land out here, okay? In the meantime, Ralph Allen had contracted with the architect John Wood the Elder to design a series of terrace houses that could be combined into a single building with the facade facing onto a park similar to Bedford Square in London. Wood and Allen secured a 99-year ground lease in 1727, and construction began on the first of these, which was to be called Queen's Square. Now, what had prompted all of this was that they were making repairs to a street, and they hit rock, and as they were sort of trying to chisel through the rock, they were driving a rod, and the rod disappeared, boom, and then it went splash. And they all said, "What is that?" And they began to dig, and guess what it was? It was a Roman bath. This is the tepidarium, and what we see up to that point here is actually Roman construction. This that we see here, this is the 19th century addition when they created a pump house. And this whole area then began to be excavated, and this is what caused great excitement and why Queen Anne wanted to go out and take in the waters. They actually created something called the pump house, where they would all go and they would sort of drink this hot sulfuric water. I've tasted it. It's absolutely awful. But they thought, they were imbibing their Roman heritage or something at this point. So this is how this whole thing sort of developed. And then it led to, there we see it, this is the pump house that we see here. There's the tepidarium. This is actually the frigidarium that we see here, the so-called King's Bath. And then there's this remodeled street frontage that we see here. So the first of these, Queen Square by John Wood the Elder, was a sort of suburb that was built just outside this medieval wall that we see here. And it is following it is developed in imitation of these West End squares that we've already talked about, residential squares in London, with this sort of individually owned townhouses that we see here that are unified by this neoclassical facade, all of which is facing out onto this amazing obelisk. John Wood had never seen a real obelisk. He had never been to Rome, although that did not stop him from writing a treatise on Roman architecture. And so he was taking this from engravings, and obviously he got the perspective wrong. He didn't really understand how big these things were, and so therefore he tapered it, trying to increase the height. It's really kind of silly looking as an object. Well, this was a great success. And the success of Queen Square then led to an extension of this street that we see here. Actually, two streets. This street called Arundel Street, and then this street that we see up here going up to the Circle, which was then to be based on the Roman Colosseum, the Royal Circus, a series of terrace houses unified by a continuous facade based on Wood's misbegotten interpretation of the Roman Colosseum. And there we see it. So you can see these are individual houses, but they're unified here by a common facade on this side. And then there we see the party walls. And you could come and rent one of these things furnished so that your son or your daughter could attend all these parties. This is what they actually look like in the back, the garden. And then this was very successful, and so they decided to extend it under a grant from the Queen, who gave some of her land to create the Royal Crescent. But John Wood, the elder, died about when the thing had gotten extended to right there, and his son took over, John Wood, the younger, who was a much better architect, actually. And there we see the whole assemblage from the Royal Circus out to the Royal Crescent. And there we see it today. And it looks like we're out of time, and so I will have to stop the lecture here and pick this up on Wednesday. Are there any questions about this? This conversion, this invention of landscape, I should mention, is very complex. And so I will only ask you in the context of this course to suspend your disbelief enough to say that he thinks it's important enough to actually have gone through this and just accept not the reasons for it, but rather the fact that it does develop, and because it does develop, it begins to affect how we build cities. Okay? Let me recap very briefly where we are with this. This period in the Enlightenment between 1700 and 1800, the invention of this new way of seeing the world, which is called landscape, we call landscape. And other aspects of this period include the development of it includes the Industrial Revolution. And that probably more than anything other than automobiles will impact cities, particularly the growth of cities, in extraordinary ways, as we'll see. So the importance of this sort of invention of this concept of landscape is that prior to about 1700, what we would call landscapes or gardens and so forth basically are all involved with perspectival space and right angles, symmetrically composed more or less. And because of the structure of this, it becomes very easy to pop these trees out here and put buildings in. I mean, that very easily can become a perimeter block of apartment buildings or whatever. This, of course, is the Champs-Élysées. This area outside the Tuileries was known as the Elysian Fields, and it went up to the horizon, which would be ultimately the location of the Arc de Triomphe constructed by Napoleon in the early part of the 1800s. When this revolution of this invention of landscape comes about, epitomized here by the English landscape garden known as Stourhead, this and this have a relationship, and this drawing by Le Corbusier in his conception of the ideal city, which is in effect one huge public park with a series of buildings that are sort of plopped down out in this pasture. We looked at examples of this. Bath, which is probably the single best example of the evolution of this from this sort of Roman then to this medieval world that we saw here, to Queen Square by John Wood the Elder, which is here. Based on the London residential squares in the West End of London, The success of that led to further speculative real estate developments that we see here, such as the Royal Circus, and then the extension of this down to this remarkable building here, which is known as the Royal Crescent. It opens out across this pasture that we see up here with a ha-ha wall inserted so that you could then let the sheep graze and so on and so forth, and you could sit in your living room or your parlor and look out across this pastoral landscape, imagining that you were somewhere, I suppose, in southern Italy. The ha-ha wall is a peculiar thing. It was, in a sense, the sort of precursor of the, as I said, the sort of architectural curtain wall, which blurs the distinction between this side and that side, which merges interior space to exterior space. And that's sort of what's happening here, in that on the uphill side, the illusion is created that there is no wall at all, but the cows or the sheep get down in here and they can't get up over the wall. So you could design with this ha-ha wall, and then you could create these sort of pastoral conditions where if we imagine these soccer players are actually sheep, we sort of get the idea. Now, let me pause here for a moment to point out that up until this point in time, sheep were pretty valuable. They still were, still are, because you could do things with them, meaning that you could shear them and make wool to keep you warm in the winter. You could use the skins to give people diplomas from Georgia Tech, although we don't use actual sheepskin anymore. You could eat them. You could make cheese from them. You could do all kinds of things. But these are not sheep that you eat. These are sheep that now have become aestheticized. In other words, you look at them. You look at them. One way to perhaps describe this is that the sheep now become ornament, but in fact they become an essential ingredient within this pastoral, this preference for the pastoral environment that tends to emerge in the early decades of the 1700s, primarily in England. This begins to affect cities not only in Bath, where these things are kind of built from scratch, but in the sort of surgery that begins to be performed in medieval cities that by this time have sort of outgrown their boundaries and have become a kind of problem breeding ground for all sorts of public health issues and so forth. Edinburgh, this medieval town that we see here with the castle, this burg, and then the bishop's palace here, and then this causeways, these two causeways actually that are constructed across what was a lake, which is eventually filled in, and then on these sort of glacial terraces going down to the water. Competition was held, won by James Craig in 1760 or thereabouts. It may have been 1761 or 2, in which the precedent for the winning design was the town of Richelieu. It is a dumbbell plan, meaning that it had two squares at either end, one at either end. The idea being you would have sort of monumental buildings or important public buildings terminating the axis, and then in this case an equestrian statue, and in this case a statue, a column similar to Trajan's column. This is the 19th century additions to that. And the lake is filled in and a public park is inserted within there. There we see a drawing of that, probably done sometime around 1800. You can see the sheep down here grazing. And eventually the railroad station is inserted down in the valley, and an art museum is actually built adjacent to that. And there we see it. This is Waverly Station. There is the Museum of Art. Here's the castle in the medieval city, going down to the Bishop's Palace here. And then here we see Edinburgh Newtown with Charlotte Square and Queen Square running this way down Princess Street. St. Andrew's Square, and I guess it's Charlotte Square. And the effect of the insertion of this kind of public park, this pastoral material here, pastoral meaning pasture, meaning grass, is in effect to isolate the medieval city and to then make it into a kind of object of contemplation, something which approximates what the aesthetic philosophers of the time, like Edmund Burke, would call the sublime. Something of great antiquity, something that shows the power of the natural world, or something of exotic, something of an object of contemplation. This is a period, by the way, following on this and on into the 19th century, when all these medieval parvis in front of the great Gothic churches are cleared so that you could begin to see them as objects. If you recall, I talked about the fact, and I showed the example of Strasbourg, which was never cleared, or the south portal of Chartres, where you're right up against this wall. In fact, you can't even get far enough back to take a picture of it, even with a 28 millimeter lens. You're right up on it, almost like reading Braille. But in the beginning in the late 18th and on into the middle of the 19th century, the medieval buildings were cleared away, say at Notre Dame de Paris, and then you now go there and there's this big open space where you can actually see the building like this. You see it as an object. In 1832 in France, all of the churches were taken out of the hands of the clergy and were put under the control of what amounted to the Department of the Interior, and specifically the Commission on Historic Monuments. So if you think about that, that is a diminution of the traditional form of authority that was embodied in the church as a house of God. Instead, it turns it into a kind of secularized object, which has to do with the patrimony and history of the people. You follow me with that? Okay. There's an upside and a downside to all things. And I will tell you that the downside of today is this gray light and this drizzling rain. But you owe it to yourself to go across the street to this parking lot and just take a look at the crepe myrtles that are surrounding it, and thank your Creator for breathing life into you, that you can see such beauty against the grayness of the light. It is extraordinary. They just look like they are on fire. And the nature of this particular plant is that when the plant stops producing chlorophyll, the carotene pigments, the yellows and reds, come forward and are reflecting a different wavelength of light, and it just makes them glow as if they were actually embers in a charcoal fire or something. It's really worth going into that parking lot and looking around. Well, we also talked about Regent Street, the Prince Regent, who was living here at Carlton House, the blue that we see down here, and his grand real estate scheme where he was going to create a series of royal crescent-like and royal circus-like structures on the old Marylebone estate. And he needed to connect the area of the West End here around St. James Square, and he constructed, acquired property and constructed this great street known as Regent Street, designed by John Nash beginning in 1809, 1811, that would finally be built out by 1841. This, because of the Reform Act of 1832 and a sort of redefinition of what we mean by public, he really could not make money off of this enterprise. And so it just wasn't proper, I guess, for him to do that. And so this was given then to the city of Westminster for the Greater London to create this public park. This was not the first public park to be built. There was an earlier one in 1833 called Victoria Park in the East End, designed by Robert Pennethorne, but that was never actually built. The green that we see here, let me do this so that it will show up on the screen. That's Buckingham Palace, that's Trafalgar Square, that's the location of Carlton House, which was torn down. This was originally the royal grounds associated with Buckingham Palace. It's converted at this end into the public park known today as St. James Park. This one is known as Green Park, and this one is known as Hyde Park. These were former royal grounds that were given over to the city for the purpose of creating a new kind of public space for a new kind of public. So this precedent is already in place by the period in the 19th century when London has grown to nightmarish levels, as we'll see here in a moment. This is on Regent Street, looking through the one of the connecting streets into Golden Square. The red dot that you see in the left diagram with the arrow shows the view. And I'm showing that because we will come in a few minutes to the outbreak of cholera in the 1840s in London, which was centered on Golden Square. And this gave rise then to this sort of reading of the city of this sort of formal part here with disease in the back, and would lead to a lot of things in the modern period in architecture and so forth, trying to create buildings that had no front, no back, which has other problems that come along with it, like where do you put the loading dock? So this is on the left the original scheme, the real estate development scheme, and on the right, as it was built out by 1841, where all the buildings have essentially been pushed to the sides, and this is now public property. There you actually see the growth of the city coming up here from the old West End, moving up across the Marylebone Estate, and you can see how these old fields, small fields, ultimately form this patchwork quilt of these real estate developments as the city begins to really expand. And there it is today, from Regent's Park down to St. James Park. And there we see it in diagram from Bacon's book on the right. This, just to orient you, is Downing Street, and this is Westminster Cathedral.